Alright, so we're gonna do the recap of the game 7 today between Nepo and Ding. And this game shows that Ding has a pretty large problem to solve, how to equalize with Black versus Nepo. Because he's chosen the French defense in this game. Probably a big surprise, but French defense is extremely tricky and you have to be pretty familiar with the ideas. Let's go back to the beginning of the game then. E4, E6, D4, D5, and I think knight D2 was a very smart decision by Nepo. I remember when I prepared French for the first time in my life to prepare as Black, to play as Black, and I prepared it for Topalov, our match in 2009, the Challengers match, which decided who is going to play versus V. Shannon for the World Chess Championship match. And I had to prepare for all those lines, E5, knight C3, ED5, all those crazy stuff. Then also looked at knight D2, but it seems to be so, so positional, strategic, and very hard to actually learn. You have to have good practice with this opening in order to play it well. And I feel like Ding is also doing the same mistake right now. He went to play this opening without really having a feel for it, especially the middle game positions and structures, which cost him a lot of time. And in the end, that lack of time, just like me in the game against Topalov, I got good position. I managed to navigate the middle game, but I left myself way too little time. And in the end, I just made a simple blunder and lost the game, and with it, the match. I'm talking about the critical 7th game of my match versus Topalov. Alright, so knight d2, c5, knight f3, that's exactly what was played in our match. Here, I also went knight f6, I believe, but the idea was to play knight c6. Also, Topalov, I think, he went for ed5 here, knight b3, knight d4, bishop c4, which was the ancient main line played by Garry Kasparov. But knight d4 is pretty stable. But idea if Black plays knight c6, you have bishop b5, bishop d7. Then you have this whole structure where White plays bishop d3, and it's extremely tricky. You gotta really understand the structures, the middle transitions, because White is planning queen e2, c4, knight f3, and then what does Black do? It's very unclear. Alright, but it seems that Ding prepared knight f6 move. And the question, of course, is what happens if White plays e5 and, for example, something like f4. Well, the answer is obvious, yeah, because you have this check and then you recapture this knight, and Black is completely winning. So then there's this little trick. But if White doesn't protect this pawn with the pawn, then he has to play like this. And after knight c6, this pawn becomes really vulnerable, and Black seems to be okay. Although, again, it's probably theory, it's very complicated. I don't really know much about the French defense, because ever since that match, I kind of really hated it and didn't want to play it for either color. But alright, ed5 makes absolute sense to recapture with the knight, knight to f3. White develops knights, opens the bishops. And we have bishop e7, standard play, bishop c4, and Black plays knight c6, because he'll have to play this move anyway, if he wants to develop his pieces. The only only other alternative I see if he plays something like this, and maybe he tries to go for b6, but there's always stuff like knight f5 possible, also queen e2, rook d1, and this knight is very shaky, on very shaky ground. The idea for White in general here is to set up this battery. The bishops are looking at the king side, and then you have some knight e5, rook d1, and just go for the attack, which is pretty complex. But again, Black's main idea is to play knight c6 here, so that's what we see. And you take on c6, and we have this structure, pretty famous structure in a lot of openings. And the question is, are these pawns strength or are they weakness? Because if you manage to force White to put pawns like c4, b3, a2, and black plays c5, a5, then these two pawns holding these three, and it's very good for black, especially in the pawn endgame. But you gotta survive until the pawn endgame, of course. So castles, queen e2, white connects the rooks, prepares rook d1, prepares bishop to d3, knight e5, aggression. Black plays bishop b7, bishop d3, because the bishop on c4 doesn't do much, and black plays queen c7. And just to make sure, why c5 was immediately dubious, it is possible, but after queen e4, g6, you have to play this move. If you play c4, then black plays knight b4, counter attacks, and but still, queen b7, rook b8, you manage to grab some stuff, and because of knight d3, bishop h6, followed by rook b1, black gets pinned. All right. White also can play bishop h6 here, but this is less clear because then he has knight c7, rook b8, and this position is not so obvious, because if you take here, then knight b5, knight d4, hitting this knight, and if you take on d4, suddenly this pawn is weak and this pawn is weak, and black seems to be fine. All right, so after c5, you queen e4, and then c4 looks very, very strong, okay? So queen c7, black also connects the rooks, protects the bishops, prepares for c5, and white goes for the offensive right away, trying to poke some weaknesses. Knight f6, g6 is also possible, but it allows this bishop to enter with a tempo. So knight f6 is played, queen h4, and c5, and this looks like sort of the main position, a critical position for both players. White seems to have some attacking possibilities, but black's defensive resources should be adequate. Nepo plays the bishop f4, which is the main computer move, and Ding plays queen b6. The idea of bishop f4 is that if black plays queen c6 looks very logical, set up this pattern, but you leave the bishop e7 without the protection, and white just takes this bishop, and he is extra pawn up with good chances to win the game, though it is still not so clear. Like, for example, you take here, play bishop f3, gf3, and then you have c4, and potentially knight goes to d5, rook to c8, and this is very, very hard to win because knight on t5 is untouchable if black can manage to keep the c4 square under control. But still, extra pawn and two rooks with bishops are very, very strong in the endgame. So queen b6. The point is, if white goes for the same thing, then black has managed to ruin white's pawn structure, take the pawn on b2, ruin this pawn structure, and now white is left with still ruins in his position, and black is just better. So you cannot do that. So knight e5, very logical. Knight goes into the central position on e5, where knight does a lot of things, controlling a lot of squares. This pawn is taboo because of rook b1 always. So centralization. And now white plays rook a e1. Traditionally, this rook goes to e1, but in this particular game, Nepo is looking for the ways to move his bishop here and then to play f4, and then both rooks are kind of useful. So g6, pretty useful move, you know, to close the bishop, close any mating threats. Bishop g5 is pretty much forced move, and rook d4, very, very important immediately to get rid of the spin, otherwise black is much worse. And thanks to the fact that f4 is now impossible because you're opening this diagonal with the check, and white is probably worse, so you have to play something like this, take, and then take on f6, and there are no threats at all. So you can play d2, you can play rook a4, d2 is very, very likely. I mean, if you take here, then there's some tricks with knight g4, knight h6, which is pretty famous. And even here, this position is completely okay for black. But you know, there is no need to allow all this. You just play d2, queen d8, and force the queen trade. And then this is very strong bishop. There's ideas like rook e4, rook e2, f6. If knight goes to d3, you always push this knight. And probably it's a draw, but again, black is very, very comfortable here. So that's why Nepo plays queen h3 and black plays queen c7. The point is he needs to protect this bishop so this knight can move away from the spin. White plays b3. And I was thinking like white cannot play c3, and this is extremely logical, but it's also forcing move. And there's so many wild complications. It's impossible for players to see also this far, but I'll just give you some lines which are possible. Like rook d5, f4, and now you have to play c4, because if you play rook f d8, there is this very thematic sacrifice, and if you go to g7, you lose both bishops, winning. If king goes to f8, there's this check. And pretty important thing is if black plays something like the threat is queen f8 and rook e7. Okay, and if queen d6, you play rook e6. And pretty much this threat ends the game. So this is possible thanks to this position of the queen, which is attacking the pawn. So the fact that this rook moves is actually pretty bad, because you cannot protect the king anymore, and rook also does not protect the knight anymore. So, but black has c4, which is extremely interesting move. The point is, if you take with the bishop, then this allows black rook to become extremely active, and rook f d8. And now, thanks to this pawn sack, the diagonal is open, and black is just threatening to be better, because if there is check, queen b2, and there are threats to the white king. Very, very hard to meet. You cannot take with the bishop, you gotta take with the knight, and then black has some incredible ideas like h6. You cannot take with the queen because bishop is hanging, but bishop cannot take because of rook h5 wins the bishop, and if bishop h4, then there is g5. Even possible, which goes into very crazy lines, like take on f6, take on d3, or take on f6 and take on d3. And at the end of the day, it appears to be a draw. Or black can also try to play here. Yeah, because if you play rook f d8 here, yeah, you can still play it, yeah, because at knight e5, there's knight h5, and the threat is to take this guy, and then the computer finds this absolutely crazy idea to defend the bishop like this, and if queen c7 with the idea of knight f4, and also with the idea of queen b6, there is this crazy b4 idea, and the computer says it's equal, but just to show you how difficult it is, if knight f4, you have rook f4, rook takes f7. Okay, with a big advantage for white. You cannot capture the king because of a check, losing the queen, but if you take the queen, then this pawn is weakness, and tactics works for white, and he's got extra pawn. So this is just an example of how crazy this position is, how complicated to navigate it. So Nepo plays b3 to completely prevent this idea with c4, and he wants to leave the square potentially for white pieces. In one of my games, I played Elheim against Nair in Aeroflot Open in the last round. I don't remember which year. And we received very similar pawn structure. I played black, and the guy just put the knight on c4, pawn on f3, and I couldn't do anything. It was just sort of a fortress, and white. But white wasn't better, so it was a draw. All right, so knight h5, very logical move. Black avoids this pin, first of all. Second of all, he wants to take control of the square, and he wants to prepare potentially f6 or f5. Beautiful move, f4, and now bishop d6. I mean, this move is possible, but what was very interesting, in fact, if you take on g5 and play knight f4, because you're threatening the queen, you're threatening to take this pawn. And if there is queen h6, there is this intermediate c4. With the idea that queen is coming to c5 and trying to nudge white king into the mating zone. And if knight g4, then there is just f5. And again, it's very tricky, but black is okay. However, white has the possibility to take on f4 and play queen e3 here, which is extremely interesting, because if rook d4, then you have c3, and if rook moves again somewhere, for example, then you have knight g4, and you have these checks, also bishop c4, it's quite possibly advantage white. So the only move is rook h4, very, very counterintuitive, but you need to keep control of the square from this knight. Yeah, and this is in a very incredible position, because black's just gonna play f6 here. So the computer gives this line h3, queen d6, threatening queen d4, c3, f6, take, knight g4, and yeah, and rook f4. So, and again, very, very close to equal position. So even this exchange sack is very interesting. But Ding plays bishop d6. He wants to keep the tension. He wants to play f6. He wants to hit this pawn. And as we can see in the game, he just took on f4. Bishop takes. If rook takes, then bishop e5. And yeah, this is pretty interesting, because the computer now shows bishop takes g6 with a certain advantage, because if you take this pawn, cd4, you cannot take the rook thanks to this mate. But if you cannot take this, then you have to take it with the pawn. And then you have bishop f6 anyway. Now this structure is very, very complicated, but apparently it's okay for white, but it's not a big advantage after king g7, because the pawn is very strong. Potentially pawn is going together with this one, queen d6, and if white goes into the endgame, then again, central pawns are extremely strong. So this was quite possible, and black has to go into this line. Okay, so and bishop g6 is actually the only move, otherwise black just takes on f4. So he takes with the bishop, rook takes, bishop e5, and now we have this important position result, which result after this material imbalance exchange. Black has a pair of bishops, very strong dark squared bishop. He has completely nullified white's attack on the king side. This king is slightly vulnerable. So it's bishop, two bishops and pawn versus bishop, rook, and pawn. In material terms, black is doing absolutely fine. So Nepo plays rook h4, attacking move. He doesn't want to allow black take on c3. And now I thought that bishop c3 was still possible. And the computer shows absolutely crazy line, which ends up in this, okay? So bishop h7, king g7, and there is no mate, all right? Which is a crazy thing, because the bishop hits this very important square, which otherwise would be just the end for black. And after queen e3 with the threat of queen g5, there is king e7. You just coolly go with your king, queen d6, and you have this incredibly rare pawn structure. Black has these 4 pawns, white has these 2 pawns, but the presence of this powerful bishop, the idea of f5, rook h8, centralized pieces, you know, this is extremely double-edged. I wouldn't be surprised if, you know, both sides can play for a win here, but it was possible, okay? And black is definitely not worse, but it was kind of scary to move your king to e7, because after in the game Ding played rook d8. He wanted to activate rook with the tempo, prevents rook h7 thanks to rook d3, but after bishop e4, this pawn is now protected, and black really needs white to move this pawn so he can put the beautiful bishop on d4 and then push the central pawns supported by the bishop, but white refuses to do that. And now after bishop e4, white also forces the trade of one pair of bishops, in which case, you know, then white king becomes more defensible, less threats. So Ding takes on e4. The computer plays bishop a6, but I don't really understand that move. Probably the idea of provoking c4 and then to play bishop d4, but it looks very, very complex to me. I kind of like Ding move here. And then he plays rook d5. He wants to keep the bishop on e5, which makes sense. The computer plays bishop f4 with the idea of e5. If that works, it's great. If it doesn't, then I think white is better. Rook d5, again, trying to provoke white into playing c4, so you can get the square with the check. Nepo plays rook h4, and at this point we can see that both players were like really down on the clock. While it's only moved 28, they still have to make 12 more moves, and it's 15 minutes left for very complicated position. Very, very complicated because it seems like black should have an easy game. He has very solid pawn formation, very strong bishop, easily defensible pawns. But, you know, Nepo just finds these incredible resources. He leaves the pawn here to control the square. This rook can go to c4, attack this pawn. And again, black should have sufficient defensive resources. He plays queen d6, but he plays very, very aggressively. Very aggressively. Queen d6 with the idea of rook d1. If white takes on h7, so queen e3 must be played. Nepo counterattacks with queen h6 threat. h5 is played, g3, closing the bishop, closing the attack, leaving the rook open. And now Ding plays bishop f6. It seems that he could just play very, very quiet chess, like bishop g7, king h7, put the bishop here, pawns here, and with this doubling of these heavy pieces on the d file, which is the only open file, white doesn't have any open files. I think black is just doing absolutely well with a small advantage, but Ding, for some reason in this position he decides to go very, very tactical. I think that was wrong approach. The retreat of the bishop creates the threat of rook d3 attacking this pawn because the bishop no longer hangs. But white plays rook c4, protects this pawn, and potentially counterattacks this pawn. So h4, again, with so much little time left on the clock, I'm not sure why black is actually trying to force the complications here. Again, a simple bishop g5 followed by a5, improving your structure, preventing b4 break, allowing the king to move. Looks for a very, very powerful game for black because, again, you have very strong presence here. Rook is always threatening to take over, you know, some squares with the tempo. Bishop on g5 potentially can go to d2. And if any b4 is happening, the bishop can always swing back and just get to the white king. So a5, I think, is very human. h4, this move does not look very human. And on the other hand, you know, it is very forcing. And now Ding finds the best move. No, he didn't. Yeah, he played this move, which appears to be a mistake. And the move that should have been played was bishop e5, and I'm pretty sure he forgot that if white plays rook e2, he can still take this pawn. Because if you capture, there is check, check, and you recapture the material with a big advantage for white. So yeah, but it's kind of weird, yeah? It's just two moves combo, and he just spent like 3 minutes playing h4, and then he spends 3 minutes, you know, calculating this. And after bishop e5, you know, how do you protect this pawn? The only way to protect it is to play something like queen e2, and then black plays like this, and this bishop is untouchable, right? There is no pawn that can remove him. There is constant threat of rook d2, and potentially black king can go to g4. This is double pawn. It means that if h5, there is always g5 possible. So it seems very likely that white has to play something like rook f1 and just go for the, you know, all the trades and make a draw, which seems to be a logical result for this game. And if queen f2, then it's just rook d2, very simple, and you can make a draw like this, right? Repeat the position. So Ding plays rook d2 first. He forgets to play bishop e5, which is not a critical blunder, but it makes life for white much easier. Nepo misses queen g3 idea, preventing bishop e5. but he plays rook e2, and now rook d1 check would just repeat the position because of king g2. Then the possibility is to play queen d5, but here no, that is no such possibility. Actually rook d1 is already late, yeah, because king g2, and then queen f3 comes with the idea of rook f2, so it's advantage white. So in this case, Ding plays rook d3, but he blunders queen c5. So the question is in this position, yeah, maybe it was still possible to return the rook to d5, because white king is definitely better on g2 than on g1. So it's again, if rook d1 check, after king g2, if you give a check, and white plays queen e4. Yeah, because if queen f3, then there is this check, deflection, you win the queen, but queen e4, and white has a big advantage, yeah, because rook f2, and then he just managed to protect the king. White's idea, you know, he grabs the pawn. Now there is material pawn equality, but white has extra exchange, and the bishop is not useful in the attack. So this rook d2 was pretty critical mistake. The only way to play was probably to admit that you're wrong, but I still think it's already late, because white plays rook e4, prevents the bishop going to e5. So he plays rook d3, but after queen c5, black problem is whenever queen goes, there is check or queen c8, and you trade the queens, thanks to this exposed king. If the king was on g7, then it would be a completely different story. Then black can play queen b8, queen a6, you know, and he can hope for some play. Now the only way for black to play is what he did, check, and queen d3, but after rook f2, very simple move. King is protected, rooks are protecting white king from every possible check. The bishop is hanging, and he has no moves. Yeah, that's the crazy part, you know. It looks like white king is open, but these two rooks actually really protect him well, and black is lost. He plays king g7, but after rook cf4, the bishop is under attack. If the bishop moves anywhere, there's rook f7, and it's black that gets mated, because this whole thing doesn't really work. The only thing that black can try, if he can play like this, but the problem is after check, it's just one check, and king ranks to h3, and rook protects the king, and again, there is no entry point to get to this king. So Ding plays here queen c3, and he resigns because white just gonna take on c3, take on f7, and white has actually extra pawn and exchange, and he's gonna take this pawn as well. And at bishop d4, there is rook d7. So it's a completely lost game. So Ding made a huge sharp play. When he was down on the time, he could just easily stand here, just play bishop g7, a5. Instead, with lower time, he goes very sharp, and he forgets to play bishop e5, and he blunders with rook d2, and after rook e2, white is just better. If he had played bishop e5, probably the game would have been a draw. And I'm pretty sure that's what he wanted to play. But, you know, sometimes, you know, you get nervous, you have 5 minutes left, you have to make 9 more moves, very complicated position. And again, the middle game is pretty obvious. Black was not really that familiar with it, you know. He had to work very hard to find those moves, and he did find it, but it took a lot of time. So there it is, a game decided by the blunder in a time trouble. A very common theme, very common. Hope you enjoyed the video. Again, put your likes, subscribe please, and I'll see you for the recap of the next game, because after this game, Nepo is back to the leading by 1 point, and you know, the commentators are kind of astonished. I am not surprised with the fighting spirit of these guys. They've been fighting every game. It's like hit and return hit, hit and return hit. But now Ding is has to you know, return the favor again, and I'm not sure, you know, it's gonna work this time. There are not that many games left. This was game number 7, and it's exactly half point through the match. And let's hope he can come back, and then we'll see more exciting games. So party on, friends, and I'll see you for next recap.